When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem.
Hey, gel here, oğlum.
In the temple courts, he found people selling cattle, sheep and doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. So he made a whip out of cords and drove all from the temple courts, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. To those who sold doves, he said, "Get these out of here. Stop turning my father's house into a market." His disciples remembered that it is written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." The Jews then responded to him, "What sign can you show us to prove your authority to do all this?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days." They replied, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you are going to raise it in 3 days?" But the temple he had spoken of was his body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples recalled what he had said. Then they believed the scripture and the words that Jesus had spoken.
No May! No Brexit! No racism!
A number of people here. Look at a number of signatures. On that proceeding, they're saying this is categorically bad for the NHS.
There's a man with a gun over there telling me I got to beware. I think it's time to stop. Children, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going on.
Before Trump's speech was even finished, many were already making their way to the Capitol.
What a field day for the heat. 1,000 people in the street, singing songs and a carrying signs. Mostly say hooray for our side. It's time we stop. Hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down.
In 2019, Amnesty International reported a huge surge in protests around the world. From Hong Kong to Port-au-Prince, from Barcelona to Beirut, waves of people took to the streets demanding a change from those in power. There were protests about governments, there was anger about policy, and there has been rage about endemic police brutality and racial injustice. There have been climate strikes and anti-lockdown protests. And then, of course, in America, post-election demonstrations became violent. The Capitol was stormed by a mob of protesters, with the National Guard, so ominous and obvious during the Black Lives Matter protests, conspicuous by its absence. Now, I was appalled by those riots in Washington, as I'm sure you are, and maybe you agree with the words of the House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, who said the violent and deadly act of insurrection targeting the Capitol, our temple of American democracy and its workers, was a profound tragedy and stain on our nation's history. Now, those words really stood out for me. The temple of American democracy. The US Capitol building is certainly awe-inspiring, and its architecture has been inspired by the great domed cathedrals of Europe. It has immense and intimidating scale, symbolising supremacy and statehood. What a magnificent building. Just look at the impressive stones in the walls. Maybe those words sound familiar from a couple of weeks ago. If democracy is supposed to be a system of government by and for the whole population, one might reasonably protest that the US's temple of democracy does often fail in its duty to the poor and oppressed members of its society. Now, obviously, January's violence in Washington was unacceptable. There's little doubt that any legitimate protest was manipulated by powerful people pursuing another agenda. But we mustn't forget that behind some of these protests, there was a cohort of people living in poverty who were being genuinely failed by their capitalist culture and felt that no one was listening. No one was listening. Last summer, there were passionate protests against immense institutional injustice in the Black Lives Matter demonstrations. And the leaders of Washington's Temple of Democracy ensured that those marches were policed harshly. Was anyone listening to the people's cries for justice? Apparently not. The question is, will they now? And throughout history, empires and institutions that have been founded on injustice or oppression do eventually fall. We've seen it with apartheid, with the Berlin Wall, with communism to some extent. Maybe even one day we will see it with the temple of a supposedly democratic capitalist society. Who knows? But let's return to the temple in our reading this morning. Another glorious building, but it would appear a building that was not fit for purpose. Now, covering around 35 acres and attracting worshippers from all over the world, Herod's temple was the third one to be built in that place in Jerusalem. And it's difficult for us to appreciate how important this temple was to the Jewish nation. Centuries earlier, Solomon had built a splendid temple to accommodate the Ark of the Covenant. It was a house where God could be worshipped in beautiful surroundings. This temple soon became more than a place where people just came to seek God. It was considered to be the place where God actually resided, the space where heaven and earth somehow met. Destroyed by the Babylonians, Solomon's temple was rebuilt in the days of Nehemiah. However, this paled in comparison to its original and was subsequently desecrated by the Syrians. The historian Josephus records that King Herod sought to perpetuate his name through grandiose building projects which were funded by heavy taxes. And so he rebuilt this temple in Jerusalem on a grand scale. Not necessarily for holy reasons. Just note that this is the same Herod that butchered the Bethlehem babies and is known to have executed several family members during his lifetime. Historians describe him as possessing intellect without morals, ability without scruples, and courage without honour. Would it be fair, therefore, to describe Herod's temple as some kind of vanity project, or a way in which a corrupt tyrant might choose to make his mark? But you see, when it came to their temple, seemingly his subjects were prepared to overlook its donor's depraved lifestyle. And so, a source of national pride, their temple's gleaming marble edifice dominated the landscape, the focal point of Jerusalem. What magnificent buildings, Jesus' disciples remarked in our gospel reading last month. Teacher, look at the impressive stones in those walls. Now, this temple was a busy place in Jesus' day. Priests and Levites maintained a daily cycle of prayer and ritual within the temple courts. Sacrifices were made, prayers were offered, forgiveness was pronounced. Rabbis would discuss the finer points of the law within the temple colonnades. In many ways, the temple was also a focal point of Jewish national ideology. But as an institution, it was corrupt. By the time that Jesus turned the tables on the temple authorities, everything about the place had come to symbolise a deep distortion in God's relationship with his people. For one thing, the temple was a place where there was money to be made. Pilgrims who had travelled long distances needed to acquire their sacrificial animals from somewhere after all. Come with cash, change it locally, buy a pure animal ready for sacrifice. And maybe this business had been established in good faith. But the trade overflowed indiscriminately into the temple courts, preventing peaceful prayer. Unable to enter the central temple courts, Gentile outsiders wanting to worship had nowhere else to pray. Was anyone listening? Did anyone care? And meanwhile, the priests and the traders seemed to do suspiciously well out of this business. But Jesus wasn't just protesting about sacrificial sales and dodgy deals. Something darker was afoot. The spiritual leaders of the Jewish nation seemed more interested in advancing their own position than they were in advancing the kingdom of God. And meanwhile, the zealots who wanted to establish God's kingdom on their own violent terms used the temple as a symbol of national pride. Now, they were unholy revolutionaries, longing for a military messiah who would overthrow the Romans by force. And their vision of God's kingdom was fundamentally flawed. And Jesus called them brigands and thugs as he cast them out of his Father's house. And perhaps some observers might have called his actions a violent act of insurrection targeting our temple. Miss Thomas taught at my secondary school for her entire professional life. When newly qualified, she taught my aunt, and she was a formidable deputy head in my day, loved and feared in equal measure. And with Miss Thomas, you always knew when you were in trouble. What are you doing? Who on earth do you think you are? Who on earth do you think you are? Ooh, only a foolish girl would have dared answer that question. And of course the point was to put the perpetrator properly in her place, reminding them who was in charge. Now, the indignation felt by the temple authorities when Jesus turned those tables would have eclipsed Miss Thomas many times over. As far as the priests were concerned, Jesus did not have the authority to act as he did. throughout the Gospels, people were constantly amazed by Jesus. This carpenter, not a renowned rabbi or established scribe, telling people on his own authority how God's kingdom was coming about. You see, those days, religious teachers were painstaking and pedantic, rabbis relying on traditional arguments, quibbling and quoting extensively from other sources. And Jesus, he spoke with an authority of his own. He was a Galilean. To hear somebody from the hill country teaching with such audacity was astonishing. Now, many did find Jesus' message refreshing and liberating. However, as Carolyn reminded us last month, Jesus was rejected when he preached in his hometown. Those listening to him were more than astonished. They were offended. Isn't this Joseph's son? The one we've known since he was in short pants? Who on earth does he think he is? Who on earth, indeed. Now, like John writing his gospel, we of course live on the other side of Easter Sunday, and from this privileged perspective, we recognise that Jesus has all authority in heaven and on earth, that Jerusalem's temple courts and Nazareth's synagogue are the merest fraction of that domain. But of course, the priests could not see this. The temple may have been God's house, but actually they were in charge. They were the way to approach God. The whole system of sacrifice and prayer was mediated through them. Who was this upstart to challenge that authority and to claim divine authority of his own? What are you doing, they demanded. If God gave you the authority to do this, prove it by showing a miracle. All right, Jesus replied, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. What? They exclaimed. It's taken 46 years to build this temple, and you can rebuild it in 3 days? Now, Jesus, of course, as we know, preached in paradoxical truths and parables, and his temple had nothing to do with Herod's house of marble. The era of ritual and sacrifice was coming to an end. One final sacrifice for sin still had to be made, but then a new and living way would open for people to approach God. Prayer would be offered through one last great high priest who would sit at the right hand of the Father in heaven, interceding for his people. In himself, Jesus was to fulfill all the functions of the temple building as a place to meet God. God had sent his Messiah to save his people. They would be rescued from the dark powers that held them captive. Their sins would be forgiven. A new covenant would be made. And in Jesus, God was doing everything that he had promised, but in a way which turned everyone's expectations upside down. Godly wisdom was turning worldly wisdom on its head. The foolishness of the cross. And ultimately, godly strength would triumph through this apparent weakness and defeat at Jesus' crucifixion. Only the crumbling western wall remains now of Herod's great temple. For Orthodox Jews, this is the most sacred of places. For them to be at the western wall is the closest they can get to being in the presence of the divine, still believing that this is the place where heaven and earth meet. Many gather there to pray every day, hoping that they will have the ear of God in that place, and others send prayers on little slips of paper which are placed into the cracks between the stones. Meanwhile, the New Testament talks about a different temple altogether, paradoxically positioned in a time and space beyond Jerusalem. this temple is based on the foundation laid by Jesus Christ. It is not a building, it is far greater than that. This temple exists wherever and whenever God resides among his people. You are the temple of God, Paul told the church at Corinth. God himself is present in you. Come to Christ, the living cornerstone of God's temple, added Peter. You are living stones that God is building into his spiritual temple. Churches are made up of people, not of bricks and mortar. And surely the past 12 months have demonstrated this to us more than ever. Together, we form a holy space where God's Spirit lives and moves, amongst whom prayers are made, forgiveness is offered, and love is spoken. You are a chosen people, Peter continued in his first letter, royal priests, God's treasured possession, and as a result, you can show others the goodness of God, for he called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. So there's the challenge for us all today, to show others the goodness of God, for he has called us out of darkness into his wonderful light. Inspirational as those words sound, I suspect that many of us are struggling to imagine how we might actually achieve this over the next few months. Recently, our JSP material challenged us to think about how we might move forward when we emerge from this fog of lockdown existence. And we reflected on the potential post-pandemic needs of those who've been working on the front line, people who've been shielding alone and are craving community again, those emerging with significant mental and physical health problems, people who have lost loved ones, and those also who've been hardest hit by the economic lockdown. And inevitably, our society will have been changed in many ways by this pandemic, but sadly also some challenges will remain the same. Black lives, for example, still matter. Poverty is becoming endemic in our society. International trade justice still remains. Climate change is an ever-present issue. And this can all seem overwhelming. So many ways in which we could get busy once we open our building. Or maybe just too many things to think about. Where do we start? Maybe like me, you feel it's all too much. You feel drained after a year of this grinding background anxiety and all the ongoing issues of your own that you have to face. Today, we've heard how Jesus cleared out the noise and busyness from the temple, declaring that his Father's house should be a place of prayer, especially for outsiders with nowhere else to go. And so, can I suggest that we need to avoid instant busyness and planning and new ideas, because so many things have been cleared out of church life due to COVID. Perhaps it would be wise not to clutter it up again too quickly. Having said that, eventually we must start rebuilding, or we will fail and fall. I'd like us to reflect for a few minutes on Peter's description of us as living stones. Maybe not magnificent pieces of chiselled marble, maybe just individual hunks of ordinary Lancashire gritstone. Now, I'm always fascinated by stone structures assembled without mortar. Dry stone walls need good foundation stones. Different sizes of stone, carefully chosen, face outwards, maintaining the wall's integrity. And joining stones extend through the centre of the wall, tying opposite sides together. And small heart stones fill spaces within the centre of the wall and coping stones are placed on top. Foundation, facing, joining, supporting, hearting, coping. What kind of stone are you? There are so many spiritual lessons we could draw from meditating on this, but I offer you these 3 possibilities. First, we must recognise that we support one another as living stones by our simple presence in the structure. Each of us is vital. You are vital. We cannot afford for anyone to drop out. Secondly, within our walls, we need to ask how we can create loving space for those who are wounded, bereaved, broken and anxious. And thirdly, in keeping with Jesus' words, we need to have a house of prayer, maybe before we dive into business as usual. We're going to think about this and respond in prayer in a couple of minutes. But first, I'd like to invite you to still your soul in silence with this song from Don Francisco.
In the lives of those who follow, there's going to come a time when rhythm starts to stumble, when sing-song swallows rhyme, when imaginations crumble, false foundations turn to dust, towers fall to piles of stones and girders into rust. Till you let the blood of Jesus wash the rubble from your mind, and your eyes again can see the one you almost left behind. When theology's in tatters and reason is absurd, still your soul in silence, listen for his word. So many turns, so many ways, so many voices cry, standing at the crossroads, watching time go flashing by. Indecision paralyzes, it's the fear of choosing wrong. But waiting is a step itself, and you're wondering too long. So again you search the scriptures, and again you ask your friends, but last of all, the one who's known the beginning from the end. In the clamor and confusion and the blindness of your choice, still your soul in silence, listen for his voice. Rome is full of ruins, Babylon is gone, the temple's just a memory that some still dwell upon. But deep within a place that sword and veil had once denied, a tree of life is growing, living waters flow beside. Far beyond all human reason and words upon a page, his glory lightens all who fret their hour upon this stage. To know him is our freedom, to hear him is release. To fix your heart and soul on him is rest and perfect peace. Far beyond all human reason and words upon a page, his glory lightens all who fret their hour upon this stage. To know him is our freedom, to hear him is release. To fix your heart and soul on him is rest